town remembered her as someone who listened. They remembered the way she kept her office windows shaded from the harsh sun, the way clients left holding their folders a little lighter, as if a private burden had been eased. Her name was Evelyn Hart. For nearly 2 decades, she was not only a therapist but a quiet institution in a town that liked to think of itself as immune to extremities. She ran a modest practice above a florist on Main Street, taught a weekly support group at the community center, and once a year organized a grief workshop in the church basement. Her credentials were framed and hung precisely. Her license immaculate. Her references impeccable. She was, by every measure the town respected, the right person to help the people who needed help most. Missing person reports began to arrive like rain at first. Sporadic. Dismissed. Explained away. A 26-year-old man named Marcus, who had been seeing Evelyn for panic disorder, left for what his family believed was a short trip and never returned. A woman named Lydia, who had come for treatment after a violent breakup, vanished without a trace. A middle-aged veteran, stoic and new to therapy, stopped answering his phone. The coroner's reports never came. There were no bodies. There were only gaps where faces used to be and the ache of unanswered questions. Police initially treated the disappearances as unrelated. Highways. Fresh starts. The hidden lives people live when trauma becomes too heavy to carry in public. Evelyn was cooperative, and cooperation became a small shield. She filled out lengthy intake forms, provided appointment histories, and answered the routine questions about therapy notes and informed consent. Each time she spoke, she did so in the same measured way, the same cadence that had comforted clients for years. She offered nothing that looked criminal. She offered explanations that felt like medicine. The pattern that would eventually break the town's patience was not in the way the therapist presented herself, but in what she had left behind in drawers and on digital devices. A young detective named Ana Morales, assigned to the missing person investigations, was the first to notice a detail others had missed. The disappearances were clustered. Each missing person had been in therapy with Evelyn within 6 months of vanishing. Each had cited the same recurring nightmares, the same fixation on a private memory that refused to reconcile. Each, when last seen, had appointments scheduled and had shown the small, hesitant progress that sometimes precedes abandonment or recovery. Anna collected the mundane paperwork, billing statements, appointment logs, intake forms, and began to map the overlaps. She noted a pattern of cancellations that looked less like cancellations and more like gentle nudges away. She found records of referrals to programs that did not exist. There were notes in Evelyn's handwriting that read as clinical, then cross into something else. Obsessions rendered in ink. She found a carefully kept list of names, dates, and a column titled Resolution. The column was not coded. It was a ledger of outcomes where a check mark meant a person had been resolved. The town rallied around Evelyn at first. In the barber shop and the church pews, people speculated. Clients sometimes left for a fresh start. Therapists gave their professional nods in private. Without bodies, a conviction would be impossible. The detective pursued other leads. The exes, the previous employers, bar tabs, phone triangulation, but nothing connected beyond the therapist's office. The case began to stall in the fog of small-town loyalties and the legal weight of presumption. Then someone from the community center called the police with a simple, terrified message. Evelyn had shut her practice down overnight. The flowers in the office below wilted. The sign on the door had been turned to closed. Her car remained in the parking lot. Inside, the office looked like someone had scrubbed for appearances. Files were stacked, receipts bundled. But in the locking drawer of her desk, beneath the neatly organized bills, the detective found a small external hard drive, wrapped in a scarf. There was no password visible. There was a note folded and tucked in the scarf, no ink. Just a faint smear, as if someone had pressed a cloth against fresh tears and left it there. The detective took the drive to the lab and handed it to a forensic analyst. They expected to find routine backup files, billing records, encrypted client notes, perhaps an old playlist for the therapy waiting room. What they did not expect was a directory whose names were clinical and then chillingly intimate. Initials paired with dates, followed by a single word, session, and under some of them, an additional marker, final. The investigation into the contents proceeded by the legal slow slice of warrants and counsel. Evelyn's attorney, when reached, insisted she had complied with every request. and that any suggestion of wrongdoing was defamatory. Yet the hard drive, once decrypted with a court order and the reluctant cooperation of a small-town tech geek, yielded something that would not be readable in a transcription alone. The files were audio recordings, session recordings, but not the kind that therapists sometimes take with consent for training. These were exhaustive, unvarnished, prolonged captures of clients in therapy. The voice that guided them was Evelyn's, soft and steady, coaxing traumatic memories from corners of recollection that patients themselves had hesitated to visit. There was the sound of breaths, the scrape of paper, the hum of the building's heater. There were long stretches of silence, not empty but dense, like a hand pressing down on the air. Throughout the recordings, a theme emerged. A patient would tell a secret, relive an image, and Evelyn would proceed, not with standard therapeutic techniques, but with linguistic patterns that suggested ritual. She used phrasing that asked patients to visualize erasure, to imagine leaving the pain behind completely, not merely integrating it. She asked them to list the things they would never want to remember, to name the memories as if assigning them to a file that could be deleted. The language was metaphor at first, then instruction. There was no physical violence captured on the tapes, but towards the end of some files there were abrupt interruptions. A chair squeak, a heavy shuffle, the rattling of metallic cuffs or lids, a muffled sound that could only be described as finality. The town's belief in Evelyn's benign intentions fractured in the face of those recordings. The detective watched late at night, listening to patient after patient describe their private horrors while a woman they trusted taught them how to make those horrors vanish. It was impossible to separate malpractice from the possibility of something darker. If therapy could make a person feel lighter, could it also make a person disappear? The recordings were a map to an inner life no one had expected. They also contained other markers, address fragments, mentions of a retreat in the hills, and emphasis on starting new. Evelyn spoke of sanctuary as if it were a machine. She proposed the idea of a radical reset to those who were most fragile, offering anonymity and a new identity, in exchange for a promise to never return. In several of the tapes, a patient agreed softly, weary and desperate, to attempt the reset. In others, the consent sounded strained, coerced by the authority of a clinician skilled at reframing helplessness as opportunity. When investigators knocked on the door of Evelyn's small rental cottage on the outskirts of town, they found nothing but a bed made too neatly and a kettle cooling on the stove. They found, behind a false panel in the soil of a raised garden bed, a small bundle of a woman's scarf and a single dog tag that matched the name of one missing patient. They found a list of contact numbers with certain entries crossed out in heavy ink. They found a ledger of transactions, cash flows that suggested someone had been paying to disappear and someone else had been receiving that money. At the end of the first chapter of the case, the town was no longer sure if Evelyn was a savior who had helped too far or a predator who had weaponized compassion. The detective had uncovered recordings that proved manipulation. She had found physical traces that hinted at concealment, but there was one piece of evidence missing, something that would prove definitively whether the missing were dead, alive, or living under a name Evelyn had given them. In the forensics lab, the analyst opened one of the final files and hit play. The tape began with a patient whispering a name, then Evelyn's voice instructing. The audio quality shifted. There was a metallic creak and then, unmistakably, a muffled set of footsteps descending into a lower space. The file ended with a soft, distant click and then static. The detective rewound the clip and listened again, and this time behind the static a new sound surfaced, a rhythm like the tapping of nails on soft stone. The sound suggested a place beneath ground, a place where voices would be hard to carry. The file ended and the room felt suddenly cold. The detective realized that if the tapping was what it sounded like, they had not yet found what they needed to close the case. What remained was to find where Evelyn had taken people who had agreed to be erased, or to uncover how she had made erasure permanent. The last thing on the hard drive was a single file named only with today's date, an audio labeled with Evelyn's own initials. The file was short. The lab tech paused, then hesitated, fingers over the keyboard. The detective heard the soft click as the play button was pressed. The recording that followed was not a patient's story. It was a voice speaking into a room that had no audience. The voice was calm and resolute, and it ended with a sentence that no one expected. one that suggested Evelyn had been planning something far larger than anyone had imagined. The analyst stopped the playback and sent a message to the detective. "You need to come look at this." The detective grabbed her coat and left the lab, the parking lot lights painting the town's main street in a harsh, indifferent glow. She had not yet realized that the next place she was going to look would change everything. The audio on the file with Evelyn's initials was not a confession in the legal sense. It was a document of intent and an explanation of method layered in the clinical language Evelyn had refined over decades. There was no plea for mercy. There was instead a careful ledger of reasons, a catalog of betrayals and failures, both hers and those of the society that had left fragile people to drown in private. She spoke of compassionate release, and of patients as vessels of pain that could be emptied, of memories that could be archived into false lives. She spoke, in short, of an ideology that had begun as therapy and mutated into something resembling doctrine. Investigators widened their search. They looked for the retreat Evelyn had mentioned, for properties purchased under shell names, for businesses that could have provided new identities. They queried banks, hunted for wire transfers, and subpoenaed records from shelters and out-of-state registries. As the net closed, a different portrait began to form. Evelyn had not acted alone. There were accomplices, not all of them criminal in the traditional sense. There were facilitators, a notary who prepared documents, a private fixer who set up rented cabins under false names, and a small group of clients who had accepted the reset and fled to the lives Evelyn arranged for them. Some of those people had been paid. Others had been persuaded through a rhetoric that turned fear about memory into a promise of rebirth. But some names could not be traced to new lives. Some files designated final had no matching registrations, no exit logs at regional airports, no activity on Social Security or phone records. The town's worst suspicions hardened into law-enforceable hypotheses. Not all erasures were voluntary. The breakthrough came from a mundane source. A homeowner 2 towns over reported a smell at the edge of his property that he could not explain, an intermittent odor that he chalked up to farm runoff. When authorities investigated the parcel, they found a garden box with layers of disturbed soil and beneath a false stone, a shallow pit lined with cloth. There were no bodies. There were artifacts, personal items that matched descriptions from missing persons. A bracelet engraved with a name, a child's stuffed animal, handwriting on folded paper. The absence of flesh where it should have been was as perplexing as it was telling. It suggested either an attempt to remove remains entirely, or crueler still, that those artifacts had been deliberately placed to taunt and mislead. The discovery raised more questions than it answered and confirmed the truth they had begun to fear. Evelyn's methods involved more than metaphor and paperwork. When detectives finally obtained a warrant for Evelyn's home and property that stretched into the hills, they found a structure beneath her garden, an old root cellar repurposed with electricity, a soundproofed space, and walls lined with filing cabinets. Inside the cabinets were journals, Evelyn's handwriting, clinical notes, and chillingly maps. Some of the maps were literal, showing routes and drop-off spots. Others were schematic and psychological, diagrams drawing lines between trauma types and resolution pathways. There were letters, unsent, unsigned, written to people Evelyn had helped and people she believed had failed her. One journal entry stood out for its cold lucidity, a passage where she wrote of the ethical contract she had with herself. A belief that erasure could be a merciful act when the world refused to heal the wounded. The prosecution would later paint this as a gradual descent. Evelyn's supporters tried to call it radical compassion. The truth, as the document suggested, was both. A clinician whose methods evolved into an ideology that redefined consent, and a person whose private history had blurred the line between repair and control. Investigators found in Evelyn's past a catalog of losses and betrayals. A childhood marked by a parent's violent breakdown, a teacher who dismissed early warnings, lovers who abandoned her during crises. There was a moment in one of her earliest therapy notes where she recorded her own dream of wiping the slate clean, a line that would later be cited by the defense as a private fantasy, and by the prosecution as evidence of intent. Courtroom proceedings unfolded with the rawness of a town watching a gentle institution metamorphose into a legal spectacle. Prosecutors introduced the audio files, the maps, the payments, the object-filled grave sites. They called survivors, people who had been offered the reset and escaped before the finality, those who had been coerced into vanishing and later returned to tell the tale. Their testimonies were quiet and fierce, accounts of trust weaponized, of a clinician who read vulnerability and turned it into leverage. The defense argued that no body equaled no murder, that the files represented clinical experiment, not criminality. They argued that some clients had chosen to disappear and that Evelyn had merely facilitated legal avenues for them. It was an argument rooted in the ambiguity that had protected her for so long. The trial was not merely a legal examination, but an interrogation of language and intent. What did it mean to erase someone? Could the promise of a new identity be considered a form of liberty or a form of fraud? When did therapy cross into coercion? The jury had to weigh the evidence: recordings of guided erasure, financial records moving large sums of untraceable cash, artifacts hidden where bodies might have been. In the end, the verdict was not simple. Evelyn was found guilty of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, of fraud, and of manslaughter in cases where physical means of death could be proven or strongly inferred. For other missing persons, the court could only issue findings of probable death. The sentencing was measured by law but enormous in consequence. Evelyn received a sentence that reflected both punishment and containment. In interviews after the trial, survivors spoke about the lingering impact of being asked to hand their memories over like a key. They spoke about the betrayal of a profession they had entered to find shelter. Some of the people Evelyn had helped to disappear were located, some living under new names, grateful and protective of their choice, others terrified and repentant. The town wrestled with the complexity of those human outcomes. There were no tidy moral certainties. What lingered most, long after the headlines faded, was the sound of those recordings, voices in a room guided toward forgetting and a clinician's steady hand that might have become a lever. The last files on the hard drive, the ones that captured Evelyn speaking alone into a microphone, were presented at a sentencing hearing and made public in redacted form. In them, she offered a final clinical justification that read like a lecture more than a plea. The idea that memory can be pathology, and that sometimes the only cure is total removal. There was no remorse in the cadence, only conviction. The town rebuilt itself in small ways. The therapy offices that opened in Evelyn's absence posted their licenses and their privacy policies in bold type. Support groups multiplied, wary of charismatic solutions. Families who had lost loved ones without closure learned to live with uncertainty, to honor memory without letting it eat them. The case became a study in how authority can be abused when empathy is framed as an entitlement to decide for others. In the quiet months after the trial, a final act of unsettling ambiguity surfaced. A file from Evelyn's archive, overlooked by investigators, was discovered by a paralegal sifting through boxes. It contained a list of names, some missing persons, some local officials, some people with nothing to do with the case. At the top of the paper was a single phrase Evelyn had repeated in many of her sessions: "We cannot mend what we cannot name." The list itself had been crossed out, each name scored with a line that stopped short of being a signature. The story closed in the way many true crimes do, with a verdict and with questions. Some of her vanished were found. Some remained only a date on a disappearance board. The woman who had once been the town's counselor sat in a prison visiting room and spoke to a psychologist through glass. She insisted she had meant to save people, that she had fallen into a kind of overreach. Whether she truly believed it, whether she had rationalized an agency she never had, was a question left for clinicians and jurists to argue over. For those left behind, the real harm was not the legal finding, but the fragile knowledge that someone they trusted had wielded their pain like a tool. The last image those who studied the case took away was not courtroom drama, but a quiet one. A small therapy office, light filtered through blinds, a recorder on a table, and the lingering silence after a session when the person across from the clinician has been taught to imagine a life without a memory. It was a silence that could have meant peace. It was a silence that, in many cases, meant disappearance. The town never fully recovered its innocence. It learned, slowly and painfully, that healing is never neutral when given by someone who has decided the cost of recovery is final.